was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project. Shroud of Turin research project was the first and only scientific team ever to be given permission to do an in-depth examination of the Shroud of Turin.
The shroud is an image of a crucified man with wounds that correspond to the brutality that Jesus of Nazareth experienced.
So why do you think it's real?
They cannot explain how the image is in the shroud.
Barrie Schwortz stared at the DNA report in his shaking hands, and a heavy feeling settled in his stomach. After more than 4 decades studying the Shroud of Turin, he believed he had already seen every possible surprise the mysterious cloth could offer. He was wrong, completely wrong. The genetic sequences pulled from the ancient fibers were unlike anything the researchers expected to find. They didn't match medieval European handlers who had touched the cloth over centuries. They didn't align with Italian restorers who had carefully preserved it. They didn't even correspond with populations from Roman-era Palestine, where many believed the cloth originated. Instead, the laboratory discovered DNA markers linked to regions that simply didn't make sense. The patterns were so strange and inconsistent that 3 separate geneticists hesitated to approve the final report. They reviewed the data again and again, struggling to understand how these sequences could possibly be there. When Schwarz finally asked the lead researcher what the team believed they were actually dealing with, she paused before answering. The explanation she gave him that day was something he would never forget, an answer that still lingers in his mind, raising questions that no one has been able to fully explain. "Barrie, I honestly don't know," she admitted quietly. "The truth is, nobody really knows. And to be completely honest, some of my colleagues would rather not find out." At that moment, Schwartz felt a cold realization settle in. The scientific community wasn't just puzzled by the evidence they were seeing. In many ways, they seemed genuinely uneasy about it, almost afraid of what it might mean. But to truly understand why this strange DNA discovery has people whispering behind the closed doors of research labs, you first have to understand Barrie Schwortz himself. His story is just as surprising as the evidence. Schwartz wasn't a theologian or a believer trying to prove a miracle. He was a skeptical Jewish photographer who approached the mystery with curiosity and caution. Yet over time, his work would lead him deeper into the study of the Shroud of Turin, an artifact many consider the most debated and controversial relic in human history. And somehow, that skeptical photographer would end up becoming one of the world's most recognized authorities on the mysterious cloth. What Barrie Schwortz uncovered during his 40-year investigation turned out to be the kind of evidence many powerful institutions might prefer to remain hidden forever. Think about the situation for a moment. Whoever removed that burial cloth from the tomb was taking a huge risk, possibly the same kind of danger that Jesus himself had faced. In the time of the Roman Empire, soldiers executed people for far smaller crimes. So ask yourself honestly, would you risk crucifixion just to save a random piece of fabric from someone in your neighborhood? Or would you only take that kind of life-threatening risk for someone you truly believed had just overcome death itself? The simple fact that this cloth still exists raises a powerful question, one that traditional history often avoids addressing. Its survival suggests that the people who protected it believed it was connected to something extraordinary. The story that led Barrie Schwortz into this mystery began in 1978. At the time, he was known as a talented and ambitious technical photographer. That year, he became involved in an investigation of the legendary Shroud of Turin, an artifact that would eventually change the course of his life. He was the kind of imaging specialist that organizations like NASA trusted with their most sensitive and highly classified photography projects. His technical skills and attention to detail had earned him a reputation as one of the best in the field. So when a group of top American scientists asked for his help with a confidential examination of the famous Shroud of Turin, Barrie Schwortz almost laughed. And here's the ironic part. He was completely convinced the cloth was nothing special at all. In his mind, it was simply a medieval artwork, a clever forgery painted by a skilled artist centuries ago. He assumed the investigation would be quick and straightforward. His plan was simple: fly to Italy at the team's expense, examine the cloth for a few hours, find clear evidence of brushstrokes or paint pigments, and then return home within a week with the mystery solved. To him, it sounded like a free trip to Europe, an easy conclusion, and then back to his normal career. He even joked about it at professional conferences, casually dismissing the artifact as an obvious fake. It was a comment that would follow him and haunt him for the next 40 years. But everything changed the moment he arrived in the city of Turin. Something about seeing the cloth up close was different, something he hadn't expected at all. There was something about the image on the Shroud of Turin that immediately stood out. It looked different from anything the scientists had ever studied before. None of the experts on the team could compare it to any known image or technique they were familiar with. For 5 intense days and nights, the team worked almost non-stop. Sleep was rare. One experiment followed another as they carefully tested the ancient cloth, determined to uncover how the mysterious image had been created. Barrie Schwortz focused on what he did best. Using his technical photography skills, he documented everything in extraordinary detail. He photographed the tiniest fibers, the faintest markings, and every unusual feature embedded within the fabric. But as the hours passed and the results kept coming in, something began to change. Slowly, the color drained from Schwartz's face. The tests revealed something shocking. There were no brushstrokes anywhere on the cloth. No paint, no pigments, no trace of any artistic materials. In fact, there was absolutely no evidence that the image had been created using any known artistic method from any period in recorded human history. The haunting figure on the cloth wasn't painted. It wasn't burned or scorched into the fabric. It wasn't produced by photography or any technology scientists could identify. By every normal explanation, the image simply shouldn't exist. And yet, it was right there in front of them. But that's where the mystery becomes even more complicated. Here's the part that makes the story even stranger. Barrie Schwortz actually tried to step away from the project, twice. He kept telling himself that it wasn't his responsibility to solve this mystery. After all, he was Jewish. Why should he spend his time worrying about a Christian relic that was supposedly 2,000 years old? But no matter how hard he tried to move on, the Shroud of Turin kept pulling him back. Something about it refused to let go of his curiosity. The deeper he looked, the more questions appeared, and walking away became harder than he expected. Then the entire situation took a dramatic turn when a man named Don Lin entered the investigation. Lin wasn't just another scientist with a good resume. He had worked on some of the most famous space missions ever launched, including the Voyager program and the Galileo mission. As one of the top imaging experts at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, his reputation carried enormous weight. Whenever Don Lin spoke in a meeting, the entire room paid attention. People knew that when he shared an opinion, it was usually based on years of deep technical experience. During one particularly intense planning session, Schwartz finally voiced the question that had been bothering him for a long time. "Why am I even here?" he asked. "I'm just a Jewish guy with no real connection to any of this religious history." Lin looked at him calmly before answering, and the response he gave hit Schwartz with the force of a freight train. "Jesus was Jewish too," Don Lin said calmly. Then he leaned a little closer, lowering his voice. "Maybe God wanted one of his chosen people on this team." The words sent a chill through Barrie Schwortz. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The atmosphere in the room suddenly felt different, heavier somehow. But Lin wasn't finished. He simply told Schwartz to go to the city of Turin, do the best professional work he possibly could, and trust that, if there truly was a greater purpose behind it, things would reveal themselves in time. Those few sentences ended up changing the direction of Schwartz's life completely. At that moment, he had no idea he was about to fall headfirst into a mystery that would occupy the rest of his life. Later, Schwartz would say he eventually realized something troubling. Many people, especially Christians, were not being given the full story about the Shroud of Turin. But the strange image analysis they had already discovered was only the beginning. Over the next 3 intense years, the research team carried out every scientific test they could think of on the ancient cloth. Their goal was simple: prove once and for all that it was an elaborate fake, publish the results, and move on with their careers. But things didn't go the way they expected.
Instead of finding clear answers, they kept running into frustrating dead ends. Test after test came back with the same puzzling results. There was no paint anywhere on the fabric, no dye residue, no burn patterns from heat, no photographic chemicals from any known era. Nothing, absolutely nothing, that could explain how the image had formed. And the mystery went even deeper than that. It wasn't just that the scientists couldn't identify the method used to create the image. Through carefully reviewed research, published in major scientific journals, they actually concluded something far more shocking. No known technology from any time in human history could reproduce an image with the same characteristics found on the cloth. Pause for a moment and think about that. Humanity has built machines capable of traveling millions of kilometers through space. We've even landed advanced robotic explorers on the surface of Mars. And yet, scientists still cannot explain how the image on that ancient cloth was created. Today, humanity can do things that once seemed impossible. scientists have successfully mapped the entire human genome. We've learned how to split individual atoms and unlock the power hidden inside them. Yet, despite all of these incredible technological advances, one mystery still refuses to be solved. No modern technology has been able to recreate the strange image found on the Shroud of Turin. When the research team finally released their detailed findings, something unusual happened. Instead of a heated scientific debate, the reaction from the wider scientific community was silence. A very uncomfortable silence. There were no major rebuttals published. No serious attempts by other researchers to challenge or disprove the team's work. No large-scale efforts to replicate the results and prove them wrong. Just a quiet, uneasy lack of response. To some observers, it almost felt as if certain influential voices preferred that the discussion simply fade away rather than continue. But this is also where Barrie Schwortz's personal journey becomes deeply emotional. Because even after witnessing all of this evidence with his own eyes, he still refused to believe the cloth was authentic. For 18 long years, Schwartz struggled with the conclusions suggested by the research. He resisted accepting what the data seemed to point toward. And the reason was surprisingly simple: the blood. The stains visible on the cloth were still clearly red. To Schwartz, that didn't make sense. Everyone knew that blood thousands of years old should have turned dark brown or black over time. So in his mind, that detail alone kept the mystery from being fully convincing. Anyone with even basic forensic knowledge knows that when blood is exposed to air, it quickly begins to darken. Within just a few hours, it usually turns a deep brown color as it dries and oxidizes. That's why the bright red stains on the Shroud of Turin bothered Barrie Schwortz so much. To him, it didn't seem scientifically possible for blood that old to still appear red. This one detail kept him firmly holding on to his skepticism for years. If you're finding this investigation interesting so far, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next part of the story is the moment that finally broke through Schwartz's doubts. It's the piece of evidence that changed his mind completely. And to be honest, it's the kind of information many mainstream channels rarely talk about. Everything shifted in 1995 when Schwartz received a phone call he never expected. On the other end of the line was Alan Adler, a world-renowned expert in blood chemistry who had studied the cloth extensively. Adler had spent years analyzing the mysterious stains and trying to understand their unusual properties. During that conversation, Adler finally addressed the one question that had kept Schwartz from accepting the possibility that the shroud might be genuine. For Schwartz, it was the answer he had been searching for, and the one that would completely change the way he viewed the mystery of the cloth. On the other end of the phone was Alan Adler, a Harvard-educated biochemist, a world-renowned expert in blood chemistry, and like Barrie Schwortz, a Jewish researcher with an outstanding scientific reputation. When Adler spoke about blood evidence, governments, universities, and major institutions listened carefully. "Barrie," Adler said, his normally calm voice sounding unusually serious, "the blood samples from the Shroud of Turin contain extremely high levels of bilirubin, far higher than normal." Schwartz paused, confused by the technical explanation. "What exactly does that mean, Alan?" Adler then carefully explained something crucial. When a human body goes through extreme physical trauma, severe beatings, brutal whipping, puncture wounds from thorns, and the intense suffering associated with crucifixion, the body can go into a powerful shock response. During this process, the system floods with bilirubin, a substance normally processed by the liver. But when the trauma is overwhelming, the liver simply can't process it fast enough. As a result, the blood can contain unusually high bilirubin levels. And here was the important detail. Blood with very high bilirubin levels can remain red instead of turning the typical dark brown color over time. When Schwartz heard this, his hands suddenly felt cold. His mind raced back through years of photographs, data, and laboratory notes. The clue had been sitting right in front of him for nearly 2 decades. The only reason he hadn't recognized it earlier was simple. He didn't have the specialized biochemical training needed to interpret that detail correctly. In that moment, the doubt he had held onto for years finally began to fade. For Schwartz, the evidence suddenly fit together in a way it never had before. The cloth wasn't just another historical mystery anymore. In his mind, it now seemed possible that the Shroud of Turin might truly be connected to the burial of Jesus of Nazareth. But the story doesn't end there, because when modern genetic analysis was later performed on the cloth, researchers discovered results that made the mystery even deeper and far more unsettling. This is the part of the investigation that many researchers say rarely gets discussed openly. When specialists eventually managed to extract small amounts of usable DNA from fibers of the Shroud of Turin, they expected something fairly ordinary. After all, the cloth had been handled by countless people over the centuries: medieval monks who honored it, Renaissance restorers who repaired it, and modern Italian conservators who worked to preserve it. Because of that long history, scientists assumed the DNA would mainly show traces of European contamination from those who had come into contact with it, but the results didn't look that simple. The genetic material revealed markers connected to several very different geographic regions. Some traces from the Middle East made sense, since the cloth is traditionally linked to 1st century Jerusalem. But researchers also detected sequences associated with parts of South Asia and North Africa. Finding DNA connected to multiple regions on such an old piece of cloth raised difficult questions. A single artifact from ancient Jerusalem wouldn't normally be expected to carry such a wide mixture of genetic signals. What puzzled researchers even more was the pattern itself. The sequences didn't seem to match the typical random contamination you would expect from centuries of people touching or transporting the cloth. Instead, some of the markers appeared unusually concentrated or distributed in ways that were difficult to explain. Privately, a few geneticists have admitted that the DNA results were unusual compared to what they normally see when studying historical textiles. The data didn't neatly fit existing models used to explain contamination from handling, travel, or simple environmental exposure over time. For scientists studying the cloth, it added yet another layer to the already complex mystery surrounding the Shroud of Turin. Some researchers involved in the analysis have reportedly been hesitant to publish every detail of their findings. That alone raises an interesting question. Why would scientists be cautious about releasing information if they believe the case is already settled? The official position held by many academics still maintains that the Shroud of Turin is a medieval forgery, most likely created by an unknown artist. Yet the evidence gathered over decades doesn't always fit neatly into that explanation. There is the unusual blood chemistry that suggests a person who suffered extreme physical trauma. There is the mysterious image formation that scientists still struggle to reproduce with known technology. And now there are DNA findings that seem to raise more questions than clear answers.
Over the years, a number of alternative ideas have quietly circulated among researchers. In private discussions, some scientists have mentioned genetic sequences that don't clearly match standard population databases. Others have pointed out fragments of DNA that appear incomplete or altered in ways that don't fully match the usual patterns of biological breakdown over time. Because of this, many skeptics no longer try to confidently explain the DNA data away. Instead, some researchers simply avoid drawing strong conclusions at all. The evidence is complicated, and interpreting it raises questions that modern science is still trying to understand. Some of the more speculative questions being asked in private conversations are fascinating. Could the DNA suggest that the cloth traveled through many different regions in ancient times? Could the genetic material come from centuries of contact with pilgrims, traders, or caretakers from across the world? Or does it simply show how difficult it is to analyze genetic traces from an artifact that old? These questions aren't necessarily conspiracy theories. They are the kinds of discussions that often happen behind the scenes among scientists trying to interpret complicated data, but they rarely make their way into headlines or public debates. Barrie Schwortz himself eventually realized how easily the story could become distorted in the media. After years of watching reports about the cloth, he noticed that coverage of the Shroud of Turin was often simplified, exaggerated, or sometimes even completely inaccurate. Barrie Schwortz eventually made a decision that would shape the rest of his professional life. In 1996, he created a website from the ground up called Shroud.com. Over time, it grew into one of the largest and most detailed online collections of scientific information about the Shroud of Turin. Researchers, students, and curious visitors from around the world began using it to study the evidence for themselves. What makes this even more remarkable is that the site was launched years before search engines like Google became a normal part of everyday life. Schwartz also made a firm decision about how the site would operate. He refused advertising offers and turned down sponsorship deals. There would be no corporate funding and no outside influence. His goal was simple: provide raw scientific data and research so that anyone could examine it and draw their own conclusions. Later, in 2009, he helped establish the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, a nonprofit organization created to preserve research and continue studying the cloth for future generations. Over the years, many people questioned his motivation. Why would a Jewish man devote decades of his life to preserving evidence connected to Jesus of Nazareth? Schwartz always gave the same straightforward answer. "My job isn't to tell people what they should believe," he would say. "My job is to make sure the scientific evidence survives." But there is a more personal side of the story that he rarely talked about in interviews. The investigation didn't just change his career, it changed him as a person. After decades of presenting research and speaking about the shroud around the world, people slowly stopped asking him questions about the cloth itself. Instead, they started asking something much more personal. Barrie, what do you believe now? For most of his life, he had avoided that question. Raised in a traditional Orthodox Jewish family, he grew up surrounded by religious customs and traditions. Yet as an adult, he had spent many years pushing those beliefs aside, treating them as something that no longer mattered to him. But after decades studying the mystery of the Shroud of Turin, he eventually found himself reflecting on something deeper. Looking back on his journey, he once described the realization in very simple words. He said he was surprised to discover that faith had quietly remained in the background of his life all along. In his own words, it felt as if God had always been there, simply waiting for him to turn around and recognize it. Barrie Schwortz never set out to prove anything about religion. He was simply a photographer who followed the evidence wherever it led. But that journey pulled him deep into the mystery of the Shroud of Turin. A mystery modern science still struggles to explain. The blood chemistry points to extreme physical suffering. The image cannot be reproduced by any known technology. And recent DNA findings have raised even more questions. So it leaves us with a powerful question. Is this cloth truly connected to Jesus of Nazareth, or is it the most sophisticated forgery in history? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden history and mysterious discoveries.